The moment my daughter pointed a camera at me, I knew this family meeting was never about love. It was about control. I pulled into Emily's driveway at exactly 6:12 p.m., 10 minutes earlier than she told me to arrive, and even before I turned off the engine, I could feel something was wrong. The curtains in the living room were closed even though the sun was still out. 3 cars I didn't recognize were parked along the curb. One belonged to her attorney. I knew that because I'd hired him myself nearly 15 years earlier when Emily was drowning in credit card debt after her second divorce. Funny how people forget who saved them once they stop needing help. I sat there for a second with my hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at the front door, trying to understand why my stomach suddenly felt tight. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe deep down, a father always knows the exact moment his children stop seeing him as family and start seeing him as a problem. The front door opened before I even got out. Emily stepped onto the porch wearing that same tight smile she used whenever she wanted something expensive. "Dad," she said, waving me inside too quickly. "Everyone's already here." Everyone. That word hit harder than it should have. Because family meetings only happen when someone dies, someone loses money, or someone wants power. And I wasn't dead yet. The second I walked into the house, I noticed the setup. My grandson Tyler sat quietly near the fireplace, pretending to scroll on his phone while secretly watching me over the top of the screen. My granddaughter Ava wouldn't even make eye contact. Emily's husband Mark stood near the kitchen island with his arms crossed like security at a bank. And sitting at the far end of the dining table was Richard Coleman, the attorney, with a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him beside a silver recording device blinking with a tiny red light. Recording. They were recording me. Emily noticed me staring at it and spoke before I could ask. "Dad, don't worry about that," she said casually. "Richard recommended we document the conversation so nobody gets confused later." Nobody gets confused later. That was lawyer language. Clean. Careful. Dangerous. I took my coat off slowly and hung it over the chair without saying a word. The room smelled like coffee that had been sitting out too long. Nobody offered me any. Nobody smiled naturally. Nobody asked how I was doing. Not one person in that room treated me like the man who built the life they were all standing in. Emily finally sat across from me and folded her hands together like a politician preparing a speech. "Dad," she began softly, "we've all been really worried about you lately." There it was. The fake concern. The rehearsed sympathy. I'd heard that tone before in hospitals and funeral homes. People use it when they want control without looking cruel. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the room carefully. "Worried about what exactly?" I asked. Emily glanced at Richard for half a second before continuing. "You've been forgetting appointments. You missed Tyler's baseball game last month. You left the stove on 2 weeks ago." I almost laughed at that one. The stove incident happened because Mark unplugged the timer while fixing an outlet. But facts stop matching when people start building a narrative. "Dad," Emily continued, lowering her voice, "this isn't easy for us." Us. Another interesting word. Because nobody ever says us when they're about to help you. They say us when they're about to corner you. Richard slid the papers slightly closer to me, but kept his fingertips resting on the stack. "Walter," he said calmly, "these documents simply transfer temporary authority over financial and medical decisions to Emily in the event your condition declines further." Condition. Declines further. They talked about me like I was already halfway gone. I stared at the papers without touching them. Power of attorney forms. Property control clauses. Medical authorization. Asset management transfer. They came prepared. Too prepared. "You think I have dementia?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. That silence told me everything. Emily finally inhaled deeply and said the sentence that changed something inside me forever. "Dad, if you don't sign these papers willingly, we may need to consider assisted living options for your safety." Assisted living. Such a polite American phrase for losing your freedom one room at a time. My grandson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ava stared at the floor. Even Mark suddenly looked away for a second. Because deep down, every person in that room knew exactly what this really was. It wasn't concern. It was a takeover. Emily pushed the papers closer toward me. "We're trying to protect you," she whispered. But the camera kept recording. Richard kept watching. And nobody noticed the one thing I noticed immediately. My youngest son Daniel wasn't saying a single word. He sat quietly near the back wall beside the hallway entrance, arms folded, expression unreadable. Emily had always hated that Daniel could never be controlled the way the others could. He was too observant, too patient, too much like me. I looked directly at him for the first time since arriving. He held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds before lowering his eyes toward the papers on the table. Not fear, not shame, a warning. That's when I understood something important. This meeting didn't start tonight. This had been planned for weeks, maybe months. Every call Emily made recently suddenly replayed in my head. Every unusually sweet voicemail. Every random question about my accounts, my medications, my will. She wasn't checking on me. She was preparing a case. And the recording device blinking on the table meant they wanted proof that I was unstable before the night ended. Emily leaned forward again. "Dad," she said softly, "please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder. I almost smiled hearing that word. Because Emily still believed she controlled this room. She still believed I arrived unprepared. She still believed age had made me weak. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 43 years building a business by surviving people far smarter and far colder than her. And the moment she decided to threaten me in front of my grandchildren, she made the biggest mistake of her life. Emily kept her eyes fixed on me like she was waiting for me to crack under pressure. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a drink. Even my grandchildren looked frozen, like they already understood this was the kind of night people remember for the rest of their lives. I picked up the first page slowly, not because I needed more time to read it, but because I wanted them to think I was overwhelmed. People reveal everything when they believe they are winning. Richard adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Walter, these arrangements are actually very common," he said carefully. "Many families establish safeguards before cognitive decline becomes more serious." Cognitive decline. He kept using those polished legal phrases designed to sound compassionate while stripping someone of control one signature at a time. I turned another page without reacting. "And who exactly decided I was declining?" I asked. Emily answered immediately, too quickly. "Dad, this is not coming from one person. We all agreed something had to change." I glanced around the room. Mark nodded first. Of course he did. Mark had been attached to my daughter's money problems since the day he married her. Then came silence from the others. Tyler looked uncomfortable again. Ava still would not meet my eyes. Daniel remained motionless near the wall. Emily noticed the hesitation and leaned harder into her performance. "Last week you forgot where you parked at the grocery store," she said. "You called me 3 times asking what day Thanksgiving was. You missed your blood pressure appointment." I almost admired the strategy. Take small normal moments. Repeat them enough times. Suddenly they sound like evidence. "Emily," I said calmly, "I am 72 years old. Forgetting where I parked does not mean I belong in a nursing home." Her jaw tightened for half a second before the smile returned. Nobody said nursing home. That was a lie. She had absolutely said it. But manipulative people always rewrite conversations seconds after having them. Richard slid a pen toward me across the table. "This process goes much smoother when families cooperate," he said. Families cooperate. Another interesting phrase. Because cooperation usually means one person gives up power while everybody else smiles politely about it. I looked at the blinking red light on the recording device again. Whose idea was the camera? I asked. Emily crossed her arms. "It protects everybody." "No," I said quietly. "It protects the story you are trying to build." That hit harder than she expected. I saw it immediately in her eyes. Not anger. Panic. Tiny. Fast. But there. Because Emily knew exactly what she was doing. She just did not expect me to say it out loud in front of everyone. Mark stepped in before she could answer. "Walter, nobody is attacking you here," he said in that fake calm voice men use when they think they are managing an old person. "We just want to make sure your future is stable." Stable. That word almost made me laugh. I built a company from a 2-room office above a hardware store in Cleveland. I survived recessions, lawsuits, market crashes, and competitors who tried to bury me. But suddenly my future was unstable because I missed a baseball game. Emily leaned forward again. "Dad, please stop making this emotional." Emotional. There it was. The favorite weapon of every manipulator. Push someone into a corner, then accuse them of overreacting when they defend themselves. I set the papers down carefully and folded my hands together. "When exactly did you start planning this?" I asked. Emily blinked. "Planning what?" "This intervention." Nobody answered. Richard suddenly became fascinated with rearranging the documents in front of him. Mark looked toward Emily, waiting for direction. And then something unexpected happened. Tyler spoke. "Mom said Grandpa was getting confused," he muttered quietly. Emily snapped her head toward him instantly. "Tyler, stay out of this." But it was too late. One sentence from a nervous teenager told me more than anything else that night. She had been preparing the family for this. Planting doubt. Creating a narrative. Turning concern into consensus. I looked at my grandson gently. "How long have you been hearing that?" Tyler swallowed hard and stared at his lap. "A while." Emily slammed her hand lightly against the table. "This is exactly why we needed the recording," she said sharply. "Dad twists conversations and makes everyone uncomfortable." There it was again. The strategy. Isolate. Discredit. Control the narrative. I had seen executives do the exact same thing in boardrooms for decades. Only now it was happening inside my daughter's dining room. Daniel finally shifted slightly against the wall. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed. He was watching Emily very carefully. Waiting. Measuring. I could feel it. There was something he knew that the rest of the room did not. Emily took a slow breath and softened her voice again. "Dad, nobody wants to fight with you. But if you refuse to cooperate, we may have to move forward another way." I stared directly at her. "Another way?" "Through the court," Richard answered quietly before she could stop him. And there it was. The real threat finally stepped into the open. Guardianship. Legal incompetence. Once that process starts, old men lose everything faster than people realize. Their homes, their accounts, their choices, their dignity. And the worst part is everyone calls it protection while it happens. Ava suddenly looked up at me for the first time all night. "Grandpa," she whispered carefully, "maybe they are just trying to help." That one hurt more than the papers. Because she sounded sincere. Which meant Emily had poisoned the story so completely that even the grandchildren believed I might be slipping away. I looked around the room slowly. My own family, sitting there judging whether I was still capable of controlling my own life. Emily noticed my silence and mistook it for defeat. I could see the confidence returning to her face now. She thought the pressure was finally working. "Dad," she said softly, pushing the pen closer again, "all you have to do is sign. Nobody wants this to become ugly." Ugly. Another fascinating word. Because ugly was not an old man forgetting appointments. Ugly was turning your father into a legal project while pretending it came from love. I picked up the pen slowly. Every eye in the room locked onto my hand. Even Richard leaned forward slightly. Emily looked relieved for the first time all evening. And then I asked the one question that changed the entire atmosphere in the house. "Before I sign anything," I said calmly, "did Emily tell all of you who actually controls Whitmore Holdings now?" The silence that followed felt so heavy it almost changed the temperature in the room. Emily's face lost color instantly. Mark turned toward her in confusion. Tyler looked up. Ava frowned. And across the room, Daniel finally lifted his eyes and looked directly at me for the first time all night. Then, very slowly, he smiled. Emily looked at Daniel so fast, it almost exposed her before she could speak. "What is he talking about?" Mark asked immediately, his voice suddenly sharper than before. That was the first crack in the room. Tiny, but real. Because moments earlier, everybody had been united against me. Now confusion had entered the conversation, and confusion is dangerous when your entire plan depends on controlling the narrative. Emily forced out a nervous laugh. "Dad is confused," she said quickly. "He does this sometimes. He mixes up business issues with family conversations." I leaned back slowly and watched her panic build behind her eyes. "No," I said calmly. "I remember business very clearly. Probably because I spent 43 years building one while everyone else in this room spent 43 years spending it." Mark frowned at Emily. "Emily, what is he talking about?" She ignored him completely. "Dad, this is exactly the kind of paranoia we have been concerned about." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He knew better than anyone that calling someone paranoid too early can backfire if the facts turn out to be true. I looked directly at him. "Richard, before tonight, did Emily happen to mention the trust restructuring from last fall?" The color drained from his face almost immediately. That answered the question before he even opened his mouth. Emily stood up too quickly, knocking her chair slightly backward. "Dad, stop this right now." There it was. Fear. Real fear this time. Not irritation. Not fake concern. Fear. Tyler looked between all of us like he was watching a live grenade roll across the dinner table. Ava whispered, "Mom, what trust?" Emily turned toward her children instantly. "This does not concern you." But that was the problem. It absolutely concerned them. It concerned everybody sitting in that room who thought they understood how much power Emily actually had. Daniel finally pushed himself off the wall and walked toward the table slowly. Every step he took made Emily more tense. "Maybe we should explain it," he said quietly. "Explain what?" Mark snapped. Daniel looked directly at him. "The fact that Dad transferred controlling interest in Whitmore Holdings 11 months ago." Silence. Complete silence. Mark stared at Emily in disbelief. "You knew about this?" Emily's mouth opened, but no words came out for almost 3 full seconds. "It was temporary," she finally said. "Dad was not thinking clearly, and Daniel manipulated him into making changes." Daniel actually laughed under his breath at that one. Calmly, coldly. "You should be careful accusing people of manipulation while a recording device is running," he said. Richard immediately reached toward the recorder like he suddenly remembered it existed. That tiny movement told me everything. He knew this meeting was no longer safe for Emily. I folded my hands together and looked at my daughter carefully. "You told everyone I was losing control," I said softly. "But you forgot to mention I spent the last year reorganizing every major asset the family has." Emily crossed her arms tightly. "You had no right to shut me out." There it was. The truth finally slipped out. Not concern. Not fear for my health. Control. She was angry because she lost access. "No right," I repeated quietly. "Emily, 2 years ago you tried to use company funds to cover Mark's failed real estate project in Scottsdale." Mark's head snapped toward her instantly. "What?" Emily looked trapped now. "That is not what happened. You told accounting it was an expansion expense," I continued calmly. "You thought I would never notice because you assumed I stopped reviewing reports." Mark stared at his wife in complete disbelief. "Emily, is that true?" She pointed at me immediately. "This is exactly what he does. He twists details and attacks people." But the room felt different now. The energy had shifted. Earlier, they looked at me like a confused old man. Now, they were looking at Emily like someone they suddenly did not recognize. Ava looked pale. Tyler slowly lowered his phone into his lap. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a thin blue folder on the dining table. Emily saw it and immediately took a step forward. "Do not." Too late. Daniel opened the folder and slid several documents toward Richard. "You might want to verify those signatures," he said calmly. Richard adjusted his glasses again and started reading. The silence stretched painfully across the room. I watched his expression change page by page. Concern, confusion, then realization. "These are legitimate," he admitted quietly. Emily looked furious now. Dad was under stress when he signed those. Richard shook his head slowly. The filings were witnessed, notarized, and reviewed by 2 independent attorneys. Mark turned fully toward Emily now. "You knew he did this and never told me?" She looked cornered. "Because it was insane," she snapped. He handed control to Daniel. "Not exactly," I said softly. Emily glared at me. "Then explain it." I looked around the room slowly before answering. "Whitmore Holdings no longer belongs to any individual family member." Nobody spoke. "Last year I transferred controlling ownership into an irrevocable family trust." Tyler frowned. "What does that mean?" I looked at my grandson. "It means nobody can force me out of my own life to get access to the company." Emily slammed her hand against the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. "You did this because you stopped trusting your own family." "No," I said calmly. "I did this because I finally saw my family clearly." That line hit harder than shouting ever could have. Emily looked genuinely wounded for the first time all night. But even then, I could tell she was calculating, searching for another angle. Manipulators rarely stop after the first failed attempt. They adapt. "Dad," she said carefully now, lowering her voice again. "None of this changes the fact that people are worried about your mental state." There it was again, her final weapon. If she could not control the assets directly, she would attack credibility. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Actually," he said, "it changes everything." Emily turned toward him with pure hatred in her eyes. "Stay out of this." Daniel ignored her completely. "The trust has a competency protection clause." Richard looked up instantly. "Eh, what?" I smiled for the first time that night. A small smile, but enough. If any immediate family member attempts to declare me mentally incompetent without medical evidence approved by the trust board, I explained calmly, that individual immediately loses all beneficiary rights permanently. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Emily looked like the floor had disappeared underneath her. Mark stared at her like he was seeing a stranger. Tyler whispered, "Mom," but she could not even answer him, because suddenly the entire room understood the truth at the exact same moment. If Emily pushed this any further, she could lose everything. Emily looked like she had stopped breathing. Not dramatically, not loudly, just frozen. Like her mind suddenly realized every move she made tonight had been walking directly into a trap she never saw coming. Mark slowly stepped away from her side of the table without even noticing he was doing it. That was the first moment I understood how completely her control over the room was collapsing. People always move away from danger before they admit they are afraid of it. Richard cleared his throat quietly and adjusted the documents again, buying himself time. Lawyers do that when they realize the situation has become legally radioactive. "Walter," he said carefully, "this competency clause is unusually aggressive." I almost smiled. "No," I answered calmly. "It is unusually specific." Emily finally found her voice again. "You planned this against your own family?" she snapped. "You built legal landmines around your money because you thought we would betray you?" I looked directly at her. "Not all of you." That line hit harder than she expected. Because deep down, Emily knew exactly why she was the one panicking while everyone else sat there stunned. Tyler looked completely confused now. "Mom," he asked quietly, "were you really trying to take Grandpa's company?" "No," Emily said instantly. Too instantly. This was about protecting him. But nobody believed the speed of that answer. Not anymore. Once trust cracks inside a room, every sentence starts sounding suspicious. Ava looked at the papers again. "Then why did Grandpa have to lose control of everything?" she asked softly. Emily opened her mouth, but no answer came out. Because there was no good answer. Not one that sounded loving. Not one that sounded honest. Daniel slowly sat down beside me at the table for the first time that night. Emily noticed immediately. Her eyes narrowed. "You knew all along," she said coldly. Daniel shrugged once. "Dad asked me to help organize the trust." "Because you manipulated him?" "No," Daniel replied calmly. "Because I was the only one not asking him for something." Silence again. Heavy. Brutal. Mark rubbed his forehead slowly like his entire understanding of the evening was collapsing in real time. "Emily," he muttered, "why did you never tell me about any of this?" She turned toward him sharply. "Because every time I tried talking about Dad's condition, nobody listened seriously enough." "Condition?" I repeated quietly. Interesting choice of words from someone who tried to hide a failed real estate investment inside company accounting reports. Mark looked physically sick hearing that brought up again. Emily pointed at me instantly. "That project failed because the market crashed." "No," I answered calmly. "It failed because you spent like success was guaranteed before the first property even sold." Her face flushed red. "You always thought I was incapable." "No," I said softly. "I thought you were impatient." That one landed directly. Emily had always hated patience. Even as a little girl, she could never tolerate waiting for anything. Christmas presents opened early. Birthday surprises ruined by snooping through closets. Business decisions made too fast because slowing down felt like weakness to her. And that same impatience was sitting right there tonight, destroying her life in front of her own children. Richard finally leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together carefully. "I think everyone should take a breath," he said cautiously. "This conversation has become highly emotional." I looked at him. "No, Richard." It became honest. He did not answer that, because he knew I was right. The emotional part was never me defending myself. The emotional part was my daughter realizing she lost leverage. Tyler suddenly stood up from his chair. "I do not understand any of this," he said quietly. "Are we talking about Grandpa being sick or money?" Nobody answered him immediately. That silence probably taught him more about adulthood than any lesson he had learned in school. Ava looked close to tears now. Not because she feared losing money. Because she was realizing the adults she trusted had not been telling the truth. Emily noticed her children pulling away emotionally and immediately switched strategies again. Manipulators always do when logic stops working. Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "I cannot believe this," she whispered shakily. "I am trying to help my father, and suddenly I am the villain." Mark looked uncertain again for a second. There it was. The performance. Emotional redirection. Make herself the victim. But she made one mistake. She forgot I had known her since the day she was born. I knew every version of her voice. Every fake cry. Every calculated pause. Emily, I said quietly. Do you remember the summer after your second divorce? Her eyes flickered with immediate discomfort. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, I answered. The room stayed silent. You came to my office at 7:30 in the morning carrying a grocery bag full of unpaid bills because your accounts were frozen. Emily crossed her arms defensively. Dad, you cried for 2 hours straight in my conference room because the bank was about to repossess your car. Mark stared at her again, clearly hearing parts of this story for the first time. I paid off every dollar you owed. I continued calmly. I refinanced your mortgage. I hired Richard to protect you from bankruptcy filings. And I never once humiliated you for needing help. Emily's eyes hardened. You are doing it now. No, I replied softly. You are humiliating yourself now. Nobody moved after that. Even the refrigerator, humming in the kitchen, suddenly seemed louder. Tyler slowly sat back down, without saying a word. Ava wiped at her eyes quietly. Daniel stared at the table. And Emily looked at me with something deeper than anger now. Resentment. Old resentment. Years of it. You always treated Daniel differently, she said suddenly. Oh, there it was. The real wound underneath everything else. Because he works for his own money? I asked. Because you trusted him. Trust is earned. Emily laughed bitterly under her breath. Of course. Saint Daniel. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice calm as ever. I did not ask Dad for control. He offered because he needed someone who would protect the company instead of strip it for parts. Emily slammed her palms against the table. I was trying to secure this family's future. No, I said quietly. You were trying to secure your position inside it. Her breathing became uneven after that. Not rage. Panic. Real panic now. Because for the first time all evening, Emily finally understood something terrifying. The recording device on the table was no longer documenting my instability. It was documenting hers. Richard seemed to realize it at the exact same moment. Without saying a word, he reached over and quietly switched the recorder off. The second Richard turned off the recorder, the entire atmosphere inside the house changed. It no longer felt like a controlled family intervention. It felt like a courtroom after unexpected evidence destroys the prosecution. Emily noticed it too. That was why she immediately grabbed for emotional control again before the silence could fully settle against her. Of course, she said bitterly, shaking her head. Now everybody thinks I am some monster because I tried to protect my father. Nobody answered her. That was what scared her most. Not anger. Not accusations. Silence. Silence means people are thinking for themselves again. Mark slowly pulled out a chair and sat down like his legs suddenly felt weak. Emily, he said quietly, did you really know about the trust clause before tonight? She hesitated. Tiny, but enough. I knew parts of it, she admitted carefully. Mark stared at her in disbelief. And you still brought a lawyer here? Because Dad has been isolating himself, she snapped back. He barely answers calls anymore. I looked at her calmly. You stopped calling after I refused to approve the Scottsdale refinancing. Her jaw tightened instantly. Mark looked confused again. Refinancing. Emily rubbed her forehead aggressively. It does not matter now. It matters, I said softly. Because every conversation tonight started after money became unavailable. That line landed hard. Ava looked down at the table immediately. Tyler slowly leaned back in his chair like he wanted distance from the entire situation. Daniel stayed silent beside me, but I could tell he was watching everyone carefully, especially Emily. She looked trapped between rage and humiliation now. You think this is all about money? She asked me. I think money reveals people faster than almost anything else. Emily laughed once under her breath, but there was no confidence left in it. You always think you are the smartest person in the room. No, I answered calmly. I just pay attention when people suddenly become concerned about my well-being right after losing financial access. Mark exhaled slowly and covered part of his face with one hand. Emily, tell me honestly, was tonight about the company? No, too fast again. Too defensive. He noticed it this time. Everybody did. The problem with lying under pressure is that eventually your answers start arriving before your emotions do. Emily stood up and walked toward the kitchen, arms folded tightly. Nobody followed her. That told me everything. The room no longer revolved around her version of events. I watched her stop near the counter, staring out the dark kitchen window without really seeing anything. "You have no idea what pressure I have been under," she said quietly after a long silence. There it was. The shift. Victim mode again. Pressure from what? Daniel asked calmly. She turned toward him sharply. "You would not understand because Dad handed you everything." Daniel almost smiled at that. "Everything," he repeated. "Emily, I have worked 60-hour weeks at Whitmore Holdings for 13 years. Because Dad made. Sure, you always had a position." "No," Daniel replied. "Because I showed up." That one hit deeper than she expected. I could see it in her face immediately. Emily had spent years believing she deserved authority automatically because she was family. Daniel believed authority came from responsibility. That difference changes entire lives. Mark looked exhausted now. "Emily," he said carefully, "how bad are things financially?" The room froze again. Emily turned slowly toward him. "What?" "The debt," he said quietly. "How bad is it really?" She stared at him like she could not decide whether to attack him or deny it. That hesitation was answer enough. I leaned back slightly in my chair and watched the truth continue pulling itself into the open piece by piece. Nobody destroys family relationships this aggressively unless desperation is involved somewhere underneath. Emily finally spoke again without looking directly at anyone. "We are behind on some investments." Mark let out a stunned laugh. "Some investments?" The market shifted. "Emily." The Scottsdale properties stalled. Mark stood up so fast his chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. "You told me the investors were stable." "They were supposed to be." "How much?" She did not answer immediately. "How much?" he repeated louder. "Almost 3 million." Ava gasped softly. Tyler looked completely frozen. Even Richard closed his eyes briefly like he regretted staying in the room. Mark stared at his wife in total disbelief. "And you thought taking control of your father's assets was going to fix this?" Emily snapped instantly. "I was trying to save this family." "No," I said quietly. "You were trying to save yourself." Tears finally rolled down her face then. Real ones this time. Not performance. Panic. Fear. The kind that comes when a person realizes every hidden decision they made in private is suddenly standing under bright lights. "You do not understand," she whispered. Everything was collapsing. I looked at her carefully. "Then you should have asked for help." She laughed bitterly through tears. "Help? From you?" "Yes. You would have judged me." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else she said all night. Because part of it was true. I probably would have judged the choices. But not the failure. Never the failure. I built my entire life recovering from failures. What I could not tolerate was deception disguised as concern. "Emily," I said softly, "do you know why I created the trust?" She wiped at her face angrily, but did not answer. "Because 6 months ago I found out someone inside the family office requested confidential asset projections tied to my medical records." Her eyes widened slightly. Mark turned toward her again slowly. "You accessed his medical files?" "I was worried about him," she whispered weakly. "No," I answered calmly. "You were calculating timelines." The room went completely silent after that. Even Daniel looked disturbed hearing it spoken aloud so directly. Tyler stared at his mother like he no longer recognized her. Ava quietly stood up and walked toward the hallway without saying a word. Emily saw her daughter leaving and looked devastated for the first time all night. Not angry, not defensive, devastated. Because suddenly the consequences were no longer financial. They were personal. Her own children had heard everything. Mark sat back down heavily and stared at the table. "I cannot believe this happened," he muttered. "Neither can I," Emily whispered. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes, you can. Because every step tonight was planned." She shook her head immediately. "No, I did not want it to go this far." "Then why was the attorney already here before I arrived?" No answer. "Why was the recording device prepared?" Silence. "Why were guardianship documents printed before anyone even spoke to me?" Her breathing became shaky again. "Because I was afraid." "Of what?" I asked quietly. She looked directly at me then, and for the first time all evening, the anger disappeared completely. "That you were going to leave us with nothing." And there it was. Finally, the truth. After Emily admitted she was afraid I would leave them with nothing, nobody in the room tried pretending this was still about my health. That illusion finally died completely. The papers on the table no longer looked like protection. They looked exactly like what they were. A financial rescue plan disguised as family concern. Emily sat down slowly at the kitchen counter and covered part of her face with her hand. She suddenly looked older than she had an hour earlier. Stress does that to people. Secrets do too. Mark remained frozen at the table, staring into space like his brain was still trying to rearrange everything he had heard tonight into something that made sense. Tyler looked between his parents nervously. He was old enough now to understand money problems without fully understanding how quickly money problems can poison trust. Daniel stayed beside me quietly, calm as ever, but I could tell he was watching me carefully now instead of Emily. He knew me well enough to realize something else was coming. $3 million, Mark finally whispered. How did it get that bad? Emily lowered her hand slowly. The first project stalled after interest rates jumped. Then the second investor backed out. Then we borrowed against the third property, trying to save the first two. Mark shook his head in disbelief. You told me everything was temporary. It was supposed to be. You said the projections were solid. They were. Then why were you trying to take control of your father's accounts? Emily suddenly snapped again. Because we were running out of time. Her voice cracked hard on the last word. Real fear. Real desperation. And that was the dangerous thing about desperation. It can convince people they are still good while they do terrible things. I watched her quietly for several seconds before speaking again. Emily, I said softly, do you remember your mother's last Christmas? Her eyes flickered immediately. She was not expecting that. Nobody was. Even Daniel looked toward me differently. What does Mom have to do with this? She asked quietly. Everything, I answered. The room became still again. 3 weeks before she passed away, your mother made me promise something. Emily swallowed hard, but stayed silent. She said that once money enters a family, people stop hearing each other clearly. They only hear fear. Tyler slowly looked up from his lap. Ava had quietly returned from the hallway and stood near the doorway listening without interrupting. I did not understand what your mother meant back then. I continued. But I understand now. Emily wiped at her eyes again. Dad, no. Listen to me. My voice stayed calm, but firmer this time. Tonight was not the beginning of this problem. Tonight was just the first time everyone stopped pretending. Nobody interrupted. You were not trying to protect me, I said. You were trying to stop your own collapse. Emily looked down immediately. Mark closed his eyes briefly. And instead of asking for help honestly, I continued. You built a legal ambush around your own father. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair again. He knew exactly how ugly the situation sounded now that the emotional fog had cleared. Emily suddenly looked at him sharply. You told me this was standard procedure. Richard inhaled slowly before answering. I told you guardianship discussions happen in families dealing with legitimate cognitive concerns. You reviewed the documents. Based on the information you provided. That answer changed the room instantly. Emily realized she was no longer the only person being questioned. So now this is my fault alone? She asked bitterly. Richard stayed composed. I am saying legal action requires honest representation. Mark stared at Emily again. Did you exaggerate things? She did not answer. Emily, I told him Dad was forgetting things. Did you tell him Dad still reviews quarterly business reports personally? Silence. Did you tell him Dad still drives himself everywhere? Silence again. Did you tell him Dad renegotiated the Cincinnati manufacturing contract 3 months ago? Tyler frowned. Grandpa still works? Daniel looked at him calmly. Your grandfather works more than most people half his age. Emily looked trapped now from every direction. I was scared, she whispered again. You keep saying that, I replied quietly. But fear explains behavior. It does not excuse betrayal. That word hit her hard. Betrayal. Because even after everything tonight, hearing it spoken aloud by me still hurt her more than losing money. Ava slowly walked closer. To the table. Mom, she asked softly, were you really going to put Grandpa in assisted living? Emily looked horrified hearing it phrased that directly by her own daughter. No, she said quickly. Not like that. Ava frowned. But you said it. Emily opened her mouth, then stopped. Because children hear truth more clearly than adults sometimes. They do not know how to dress ugly intentions in polite language yet. Mark suddenly stood up and walked toward the kitchen window, rubbing both hands over his face. My God, he muttered quietly. What have we done? Nobody answered him. Because everybody in the room knew he was not talking about the money anymore. He was talking about trust. About family. About the moment people cross a line they cannot fully uncross later. Daniel finally spoke again after almost a minute of silence. Dad never planned to cut anyone out, he said calmly. Emily looked up instantly. What? Daniel reached toward the blue folder still sitting on the table and opened it again carefully. The trust distributes equal long-term beneficiary rights to the family. Mark turned around immediately. Equal? Yes. Emily stared at Daniel in confusion. Then why create all this protection? Daniel looked directly at her before answering. Because Dad saw what panic was turning people into. That line settled heavily across the room. I watched Emily absorb it slowly. Every decision she made over the last year suddenly looked different under that light. Not strategic. Not protective. Panicked. You thought I was going to destroy the family, she whispered to me. I shook my head slowly. No. I thought fear would. Her eyes filled again. Dad, I never wanted things to go this far. Then you should have stopped before the lawyer arrived. Silence. Before the paperwork. Silence again. Before the camera. Tyler looked at the dark recording device sitting uselessly at the end of the table. You were really recording, Grandpa? He asked quietly. Emily could not even answer her son anymore. That was the point where I finally saw it clearly. She was exhausted. Not physically. Spiritually. The kind of exhaustion people reach after spending too long defending choices they already know were wrong. Richard slowly gathered the unsigned guardianship documents together into a neat pile. The sound of paper sliding across would seem strangely loud in the silence. I think, he said carefully, these discussions should end for tonight. But I looked at the stack of papers one last time before he could put them away completely. No, I said quietly. Not yet. Everyone looked at me again. And for the first time all evening, Emily looked genuinely afraid of what I might say next. Everyone stayed completely still after I said those 3 words. Not yet. The room felt suspended in something heavier than anger now. Regret. The kind that settles into people slowly once they realize they cannot rewind a conversation back to safety. Richard stopped stacking the papers and looked at me carefully. Emily stared at the table without speaking. Mark remained near the kitchen window, exhausted and pale. Tyler and Ava looked emotionally drained in the way only children do when they suddenly discover adults are far less stable than they believed. Daniel sat quietly beside me waiting. He already knew this conversation was not finished. There is one more thing all of you need to understand, I said calmly. Emily closed her eyes briefly like she already feared what was coming. Dad? No, I interrupted softly. You spent months building a case against me. You do not get to rush the ending now. Nobody moved. 6 months ago, I continued, someone attempted to access restricted documents inside Whitmore Holdings using an executive override request tied to emergency succession protocols. Richard frowned immediately. What? Daniel reached for the blue folder again and removed another set of papers. We traced the request through internal authorization logs, he explained calmly. Emily slowly looked up. Her face had already started losing color again. No, she whispered instantly. Emily, Mark said quietly, what is he talking about? She shook her head rapidly. I did not do anything illegal. That was not a denial. Everybody in the room noticed it. Daniel slid a printed document across the table toward Richard. The request originated from Emily's executive credentials, he said. Richard adjusted his glasses and read silently for several seconds. The silence stretched painfully long. Finally, he looked up slowly. This authorization attempt was tied to contingency access procedures connected to Walter's incapacitation. Mark stared at his wife in disbelief again. You were already trying to activate succession control? Emily's breathing became uneven. I was trying to understand what would happen if Dad got worse. No, I said quietly. You were checking how fast you could take control if I became legally vulnerable. She stood up abruptly again. You make everything sound evil. Because tonight, every explanation arrives after the evidence. That line hit hard. Emily looked trapped all over again. She turned toward Mark desperately. I was trying to protect us. Mark shook his head slowly. You keep saying us. But you never told me any of this. She looked like she wanted to scream and cry at the same time now. But underneath all of it, I could finally see the truth clearly. Emily had spent so long convincing herself her actions were necessary that she forgot necessity and morality are not the same thing. Tyler suddenly spoke quietly from the end of the table. Mom, were you really waiting for Grandpa to get sick? Emily looked horrified hearing it phrased that way. No, Tyler, that is not fair. Then why were you checking inheritance stuff before tonight? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because children ask direct questions adults spend entire lives learning how to avoid. Ava wrapped her arms around herself tightly and whispered, "This feels wrong." Nobody answered her because nobody could honestly say it did not. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his arms. Dad did not change the trust because he stopped loving the family, he said calmly. He changed it because he saw people preparing for his absence before he was even gone. Emily stared at him with tears filling her eyes again. You think I wanted him dead? Daniel shook his head slowly. No. I think you stopped seeing him as a person. Silence. Brutal silence. That one landed deeper than any accusation all night because everybody knew there was truth inside it. Somewhere along the line, I had become a problem to manage instead of a father to speak honestly with. Mark slowly walked back toward the table and sat down heavily again. How long? He asked quietly. Emily looked confused. What? How long were you planning this meeting? She looked down immediately. A few weeks. Daniel gave a small humorless laugh. Try 8 months. Emily snapped toward him instantly. You were spying on me? No. Daniel replied calmly. You used company email servers for private legal communication. Richard's expression changed instantly hearing that. Emily. She looked furious now. I did not think Dad would ever see those emails. That was the problem, I said softly. You stopped believing I was still paying attention. Her face collapsed slightly after that. Because she knew it was true. Somewhere in her mind, I had already become old enough to underestimate. Weak enough to outmaneuver. Distracted enough to bypass. Dad? She whispered shakily. I never hated you. I know. She looked shocked by that answer. Then why does it feel like you are punishing me? I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because consequences feel like punishment when people spend too long avoiding them. Nobody moved after that. Richard quietly closed the guardianship folder completely now. Final. Finished. Dead. The legal attack had failed completely. But emotionally, the damage sitting in that room felt much larger than paperwork. Tyler suddenly looked at me carefully. Grandpa, are you going to cut Mom out of the family? Emily looked terrified hearing that question. Real terror. Not financial this time. Personal. Human. I answered slowly. No, everyone looked at me. Even Daniel. The trust was never designed to destroy the family, I continued. It was designed to expose what fear would do to it. Emily covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Dad? But there is something you still do not understand. She lowered her hand slowly. What? I looked directly at her. You were never in danger of being left with nothing. Confusion spread across her face. Immediately, Mark frowned. Daniel stayed silent. 3 weeks ago, I continued calmly. I finalized a separate private recovery account connected to the family trust. Emily blinked rapidly. What does that mean? It means your debt problem was already solvable. Complete silence. Mark stared at me in shock. You knew about the debt? Most of it. Emily looked physically stunned now. Then why did you not say anything? I held her gaze steadily. Because I needed to know whether you would come to me honestly, or try to remove me first. Her entire expression broke after that. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a person finally realizing the worst part of the night was never the money, the trust, or the legal documents. It was the fact that she had failed a test nobody told her she was taking. Tears rolled down her face silently now. Tyler looked heartbroken. Ava looked exhausted. Mark stared at the table in shame. And for the first time all evening, Emily stopped defending herself completely. She just whispered one sentence so quietly it almost disappeared into the room. I really thought you stopped loving us. The moment Emily whispered that she thought I stopped loving them, the entire room changed again. Not because the tension disappeared. It did not. But because for the first time all night, the conversation finally reached the real wound underneath everything else. Fear. Not fear of poverty. Not fear of losing property. Fear of being abandoned. I looked at my daughter carefully and saw something I had not seen in her face for years. Not anger. Not ambition. Hurt. Old hurt. The kind people carry quietly until it starts shaping every decision they make without them realizing it. Emily, I said softly, when did you start believing that? She laughed weakly through tears and looked away from me. Probably around the time Mom died. Nobody moved. Even Mark stayed completely silent. After the funeral, she continued quietly, you buried yourself in work again. You stopped talking about feelings. Every conversation became about schedules, meetings, numbers, responsibilities. I listened without interrupting. And every time I struggled, she said, it always felt like you were disappointed in me. I was worried about you. That is not the same thing. That line landed harder than she probably realized. Because she was right. Worry and love sound very different to the person receiving them. Daniel looked down at the table quietly. Tyler and Ava stayed still, listening to every word now. Mark slowly sat back in his chair again, exhausted but attentive. You always trusted Daniel more, Emily whispered. Daniel inhaled slowly but stayed silent. I looked at her carefully before answering. No, I trusted Daniel differently. What does that even mean? She asked bitterly. It means Daniel came to me when things were already broken. You came to me pretending they were not. Silence. When Daniel failed, I continued. He admitted it quickly. When you failed, you hid it until the damage doubled. Emily wiped at her face angrily. Because I never felt safe failing around you. That one stayed with me. Longer than anything else, she said all evening. Because there was truth inside it. Not complete truth, but enough to hurt. I leaned back slowly and stared at the darkened recording device sitting at the edge of the table. A few hours earlier, that machine was supposed to document my decline. Instead, it became evidence of something none of us wanted to fully admit. This family had been emotionally fractured long before tonight. Tonight just stripped away the polite language hiding it. Do you know why I kept working after your mother died? I asked quietly. Emily shook her head once. Because if I stopped moving, I said softly, I would have collapsed. Nobody interrupted. Your mother held this family together emotionally. I handled the practical things. Bills, contracts, problems, structure. And when she died, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I worked harder. Emily looked at me with tears still sitting in her eyes. But it felt like you disappeared. That hurt because it was also true. I had provided stability. I had solved crises. I had paid debts. But emotional absence leaves scars money never touches. Mark finally spoke quietly. Emily told me once that she spent years trying to earn your approval. I looked at him. Approval was never the issue. Then what was? I answered honestly. Trust. Emily lowered her eyes immediately. Because every time life became difficult, I continued. You searched for shortcuts instead of stability. I was trying to survive. No, I said gently. You were trying to avoid discomfort. That difference matters. People who survive face pain directly. People avoiding discomfort usually create bigger pain later. Emily covered her face again briefly. Tyler suddenly spoke from across the table. Grandpa, yes. Were you really going to help Mom with the debt? I looked at him carefully. Yes. Emily stared at me immediately, stunned all over again. Even after everything, she whispered. You are still my daughter. Her breathing shook slightly hearing that. Ava quietly sat down beside her mother now, close but uncertain. Like she wanted comfort, but did not fully know who needed it most. Then why did you wait? Emily asked me. I answered slowly. Because I needed to know whether love was still stronger than fear in this family. Nobody spoke after that. And deep down, I think every person in that room understood the answer had not been clear tonight. Daniel finally leaned forward slightly. Dad spent the last year setting up financial recovery options quietly, he said. He already anticipated the market collapse affecting commercial properties. Mark looked stunned again. You knew the real estate market was going to crash this hard. I nodded once. Not perfectly, but enough to stay cautious. Emily laughed bitterly under her breath again. Of course you did. Experience matters. No, she said quietly. Control matters to you. I looked at her carefully. You still think this is about control? You built trusts, clauses, restrictions, tests, because people behave differently around money. She shook her head slowly. No, Dad, because you never believed anybody could handle things without you. That line hit deeper than she knew, because part of me feared she might be right. Richard finally stood up slowly from the table and gathered his briefcase. I should probably leave, he said carefully. Nobody stopped him. Before heading toward the door, he paused and looked at me. Walter, for what it is worth. I genuinely believe this was a precautionary family discussion. I know, I replied calmly. And I did know. Richard was not the architect tonight. Emily was. He simply walked into the version of reality she presented. After he left, the house became strangely quiet. No legal papers moving. No artificial structure holding the conversation together anymore. Just family. Raw and uncomfortable. Mark finally looked at Emily again. Why did you not just tell him about the debt? Emily stared at the table for several long seconds before answering. Because I already felt like a failure. Her voice cracked hard on the last word. Real shame now. Not manipulation. Every time Dad saved me before, she whispered, I felt smaller afterward. I listened carefully. And when the investments started collapsing, I panicked. I kept thinking if Dad saw how bad things were again, he would finally give up on me completely. Tyler looked heartbroken hearing that. Ava quietly held her mother's hand. Daniel stayed silent. And suddenly I realized something painful. Emily had not spent years trying to steal from me. She had spent years trying to prove she was not weak. Tonight was just what happened when pride and fear finally collided hard enough to destroy the mask. I slowly stood up from my chair for the first time in nearly an hour. Everyone looked at me immediately. Emily's expression filled with panic again. Dad, she whispered nervously. I looked directly at her. I am not putting you in charge of my life. Tears rolled down her face instantly. I know, but I am also not walking away from you. That broke her completely. She covered her mouth and started crying silently while Ava wrapped her arms around her. Tyler looked down at the table, wiping his eyes quickly, embarrassed to be emotional in front of everyone. Mark exhaled shakily and stared at the floor. Daniel looked at me quietly, understanding something the others did not yet fully realize. Tonight was never really about winning. It was about whether this family could still survive the truth. For a long time, nobody in the room spoke after Emily broke down crying. The house that felt cold and hostile earlier now felt emotionally exhausted, like every wall had absorbed too much truth too quickly. I remained standing near the table, looking at my family quietly. Not the image of my family. The real version. Flawed. Afraid. Hurt. Human. Tyler finally stood up and walked slowly toward the kitchen sink, pretending to grab water just so nobody would notice he was emotional. Ava stayed beside her mother with one arm wrapped around her shoulders. Mark sat silently staring at the unsigned guardianship papers like they belonged to another lifetime. Daniel remained calm as always, but even he looked drained now. Emily wiped her face several times before finally looking up at me again. I do not know how to fix this, she whispered. I nodded slowly. That is because trust does not repair itself overnight. She lowered her eyes again. Do you hate me? That question hit the room harder than any argument earlier. Because underneath all the money, fear, legal paperwork, and betrayal, that was the question she had really been asking all night. I walked slowly toward the kitchen and stopped a few feet from her. No, I answered honestly. But I am disappointed in the choices you made. Tears rolled down her face again immediately. I know. And you need to understand something very clearly. She looked up nervously. Fear can explain behavior. But eventually adults become responsible for what fear turns them into. She nodded slowly without arguing this time. Mark finally looked at me. Walter, I need to apologize too. I shook my head lightly. You followed your wife because you believed she was protecting the family. He looked ashamed. I should have asked more questions. Yes, I replied calmly. You should have. He accepted that without defending himself. That mattered more than excuses. Tyler returned quietly from the sink, holding a glass of water he barely touched. Grandpa, he asked carefully. Yes. Are things going to be weird now? For the first time all evening, I almost smiled. Because only a teenager could summarize emotional destruction with the word weird. Probably for a while I admitted. But weird is survivable. Ava looked at me carefully. So nobody is getting cut off? No, Emily closed her eyes briefly in relief hearing that directly. But I was not finished. However, I continued calmly. Some things are going to change. The room became attentive again immediately. The family trust stays exactly the way it is. Emily nodded quietly. No argument. Daniel will remain co-trustee. Another quiet nod. And from now on, any financial issue involving family assets gets discussed openly before panic turns into secrecy. Mark nodded first this time. Agreed. Emily hesitated for half a second before whispering. Agreed. I looked directly at her. No more hidden loans. No more emergency legal meetings. No more treating people like problems to manage. Her face crumpled slightly again. I understand. Daniel finally stood up beside the table and stretched slightly like his body had been carrying tension for hours. Honestly, he muttered quietly, Mom would probably still be halfway through the guardianship speech if Dad had not mentioned the trust. Emily actually laughed once through tears hearing that. Weak, embarrassed, but real. Probably, she admitted softly. That tiny moment mattered more than anyone realized, because it was the first honest laugh inside the house all night. Mark slowly picked up the stack of guardianship papers from the table and looked at them for several seconds before handing them to Emily. She stared at them quietly. I cannot believe I almost made you sign these, she whispered to me. I looked at the papers calmly. The worst part is not the documents. She frowned slightly. What is? You had already emotionally decided I was gone before you ever handed them to me. That silence hurt her deeply because she knew it was true. Somewhere along the way, she stopped speaking to me like a father and started evaluating me like a future estate issue. Emily slowly tore the top page in half. Then another. Then another. Nobody stopped her. The sound of paper ripping filled the room quietly. Not dramatic. Not symbolic. Just final. When she finished, she dropped the torn pieces into the trash beside the counter and stared at them silently. I am sorry, Dad, she whispered. I believed she meant it this time. Not because she got caught. Because she finally understood what she almost destroyed. Ava hugged her mother tighter. Tyler sat back down quietly, looking emotionally exhausted. Mark rubbed his eyes again. Daniel walked over and unplugged the recording device without saying anything. That tiny click sounded strangely important, like the official end of something ugly. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair slowly. Emily noticed immediately and looked panicked again. You are leaving? It is late. Dad, she stood up quickly. Please do not walk out like this. I looked at her carefully. Emily, tonight was never about whether I stayed or left. She looked confused. Then what was it about? I paused for a moment before answering. It was about whether this family still knew the difference between love and control. Nobody spoke after that, because there was nothing left to argue with. Mark finally walked over and extended his hand toward me awkwardly. I stared at it for a second before shaking it. Not because everything was repaired. It was not. But because rebuilding trust starts with uncomfortable honesty, not perfection. Tyler hugged me next without warning. Tight. Fast. Embarrassed immediately afterward. Sorry, he muttered. Do not apologize for caring about people, I told him softly. Ava hugged me too, much more carefully. I am glad you are okay, she whispered. I am too, I answered honestly. Emily stood a few feet away watching all of it with tears in her eyes. When the room finally became quiet again, she stepped toward me slowly. Dad, yes. Her voice shook slightly. How did you know? Know what? That tonight was coming. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because people only threaten to put you away when they stop seeing your humanity and start seeing your value. Tears rolled down her face again. I never wanted to become that person. Then do not become her tomorrow. Silence. Heavy but peaceful this time. I opened the front door slowly and cold night air drifted into the house. Before stepping outside, I turned back toward all of them one last time. My family. Damaged. Imperfect. Still standing. You thought I was weak because I stayed quiet, I said calmly. But sometimes staying quiet is how you learn who people really are. Then I walked out into the night while nobody in the house could find a single word to stop me.